1 year of indiscriminate bombing of schools and hospitals, of mosques and churches, of libraries and universities, and neighbourhood after neighbourhood reduced to rubble. But we know that this violence goes beyond Gaza. It is a system of oppression that knows no borders. We see it in the West Bank, where illegal settlements and settler violence continue to uproot and terrorise Palestinians. We see it extending to Lebanon, where the same pattern of genocidal violence is repeating, and the death toll is now over 1,400. Just before the assault on Beirut, Netanyahu stood at the United Nations, calling schools, hospitals and homes legitimate targets. He spoke the language of war crimes before the bombs even fell. We are here today because we have witnessed a year of Gaza being deliberately starved, a year of innocent men, women and children being slaughtered. Over 118,000 people have been killed in Israel alone in Gaza, according to American medical professionals who work there, disproportionately women and children. These are not just numbers, they were real people like me and you, with hopes, dreams, families and futures. Futures have been stolen. Refugee camps, civilians, hospitals, all deliberately targeted. Over 116 journalists killed, making this the deadliest period for the press. Israel has tried to silence even those who bear witness to its crimes, and these crimes have been aided and abetted by our government and the United States. Together, our government and the United States have given Israel impunity at the United Nations and the continued sale of weapons. 1 year on, and British-made weapons are still being sent to Israel and still being used to devastate Gaza, the West Bank and Lebanon, and shame on this government for allowing that to continue. Our government speaks of peace but does absolutely nothing to make that a reality. Their calls for a ceasefire are empty words while they continue to arm the very regime that is bombing civilians and enables illegal settlements. And we know the truth. It was you, the solidarity movement, that forced this government to suspend only 30 of the 350 arms licenses to Israel. This is a small victory, showing that our pressure works. We have an admission of guilt and an acknowledgement that the UK risks complicity in war crimes. While F-35 fighter jets, all partially made in the UK, continue to rain terror on Gaza, we demand a full arms embargo, economic sanctions on Israel, and an end to diplomatic support. Nothing less will do. In the last parliament, I brought a bill forward to suspend all arms sales to Israel, and it was repeatedly blocked by that Tory government. But let me be clear, I will continue to raise this issue. I will keep fighting until all arms sales stop and our government's complicity ends. This international movement for Palestine is not going anywhere. We send this message to our political leaders, to people across the world, and to the brave people of Palestine and Lebanon. We stand with you. And we will speak up until our leaders listen, until the bombs stop. We will speak up until the siege is lifted and food and water flow back in, and schools and universities and hospitals are rebuilt. We will all speak up until the occupation ends and Palestine is free. To say it with me, free, 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 free.
On the anniversary of the horrific October the 7th attacks, I again repeat the call for the immediate release of all hostages and in light of Israel's genocidal assault in Gaza, the violence in the West Bank and the invasion of Lebanon, I asked the Prime Minister if he believes that Israel's right to self-defense justifies a death toll, according to research by US medical professionals who have worked in Gaza, has now surpassed 118,000, as well as the 2,000 people killed in Lebanon. And will he do what is morally and legally right and end the government's complicity in war crimes by banning all arms sales to Israel, including F-35 fighter jets, not just 30 licenses, yes or no?
It is absolutely frightening. What we're seeing in Lebanon is the playbook that was used in Gaza, where homes, hospitals and civilian infrastructure is labelled as legitimate targets. That's what Netanyahu did at the UN. He basically legitimised an attack on Beirut before the bombs even fell. What we're seeing is 1 million people displaced. We're seeing 2,000 people already die from the bombs that have dropped on them in Beirut. And it's frightening because we could have stop this much earlier by pursuing a ceasefire, by stopping arms sales. And actually what we see is a failure of Western diplomacy from the 12 months of a genocidal assault on Gaza, the invasion of Lebanon and the airstrikes from Iran. If we look at the past 2 decades of British foreign policy in the Middle East, there are catalogues of failures and clearly lessons haven't been learned. And when we look at what the British public think, 56% of the British public back an arms ban on weapons, only 17% oppose that. 67% believe that Israel has committed war crimes, and 84% want Netanyahu arrested if he enters the UK. So clearly there's a detachment from British public opinion and what the government are saying.
And yet you're a strong supporter of Palestinian rights, except if you were, as we heard from the ambassador, an Israeli, as Annie was saying, do you understand that need, that desire for safety and protection for Israelis?
Often I get asked, do I believe in Israel's right to defend itself? And what we see is 42,000 people dead in Gaza, disproportionately women and children, a health infrastructure completely dismantled, every single university destroyed. That is not a country's right to defend itself. That is what the ICJ is putting Israel on trial for, charges of genocide against the Genocide Convention. They are 2 very different things. And in fact, the Israeli ambassador has rejected Palestinian statehood aspirations since 2013. She says, this land is ours, all of it is ours. She is trying to achieve global recognition for illegal West Bank settlement. She called the Nakba of 1948 an Arab lie. This is not a partner for peace. I think often what is happening in the Middle East gets divided into binaries of its Muslim communities and its Jewish communities. What we see in the streets of London and across the country are communities of all backgrounds, of all ages, of all demographics coming together because they don't want to see UK complicity in war crimes that are taking place. This isn't about communities, and I understand that there has been a rise in Islamophobia and a rise in anti-Semitism, and we saw some of that play out over the riots in the summer. But when we kind of use that point, often it is to undermine legitimate grievances about war crimes. It also was a clear admission that the UK government is concerned that there is a risk that UK-made weapons might be used in violations of international humanitarian law. So if there is that clear admission by suspension, 30 out of 350, my point and many others' point is, why not the rest of them, including F-35 fighter jets, which are being used to blow up parts of Gaza and parts of Lebanon?
And have you asked that question?
Absolutely, repeatedly.
What do they say?
Well, I'm not getting an answer, and for me, it's really important because we are also signatories to international law. We have to look at the ICJ ruling from January that said it is plausible that genocide or the Genocide Convention is being breached by Israel, and to do that, we need to do everything to stop it. And our arms sales are continuing, and they're also making us complicit. It did feel like a fragile majority because when we look at seats where the Labour Party lost, whether that's Leicester South, whether it is in Bristol Central, the issues that I was hearing on the door, and many of my colleagues also heard on the door, were concerns about the Labour Party's position on Gaza. They also want the party to be committed to no privatisation in the NHS and supporting workers' rights. So when we look at where there's pressure coming from reform, it's really important to look at the pressure that's also coming from left parties as well. We also have to move away from making weapons. The UK is still selling arms to Israel, and even though only 30 of 350 arms licenses have been suspended, we are still licensing F-35 fighter jets. And with the regional war now also in Lebanon, I think the Labour Party needs to look at its obligations to international law and the ICJ ruling. I refuse to see this in a factional way. This is not about the left or the right of the Labour Party. 56%
of the British public back a full arms ban on sales to Israel. And that's what we need to remember. 40,000 Palestinians have been killed. And we need to reflect on that before we make this a political football between the right and the left of the Labour Party.
Zarah Sultana, you are calling for all arms export licences and sales to Israel to end. Why?
Over 40,000 Palestinians have been killed, majority women and children. Over 90,000 people have been wounded, and over 10,000 people are buried in the rubble from Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza. And if the government is recognising that British-made weapons might be complicit in breaking international law, then I don't understand how we can only be suspending 30 out of 350 licences, including components for F-35 fighter jets, which have been described by their manufacturer as the most lethal fighter jets in the world. Only yesterday, a Danish NGO confirmed that an Israeli F-35 fighter jet was instrumental during the attack on Al-Mawasi, a designated so-called safe zone on July the 19th, which killed 90 people. So on one hand, the government is saying that they are stopping arms that might be used in Gaza, except F-35 fighter jets. And it's a bit like saying you've given up gambling, except you're placing bets each way at Cheltenham. As we debate here in Westminster, raining down hell on Gaza is Israel's fleet of F-35 fighter jets, planes described by their manufacturer as the most lethal fighter jet in the world. Israel has armed these jets with 2,000-pound bombs, explosives with a lethal radius of 365 metres. That is the equivalent of 58 football pitches. A recent UN report identified these bombs as having been used in emblematic cases of indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks on Gaza, attacks that clearly violate international law. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, I raise this because every F-35 fighter jet is made in part here in Britain in a deal estimated to be worth £368 million. This is just one example of Israel's use of British-made arms in its assault on Gaza that has killed over 38,000 people, disproportionately women and children. The legal threshold for these sales has clearly been met, so they should be banned. There is a clear risk British-made weapons might be used to commit or facilitate serious violations of international humanitarian law. Hence, in February, UN experts call for these sales to be immediately ended. And other countries have also suspended sales. Spain, Canada and the Netherlands, just to name a few, have suspended sales. And previous British governments have suspended sales too after far less Israeli assault. Margaret Thatcher in 1982, Tony Blair in 2002, Gordon Brown in 2009, and David Cameron in 2014. Today, the Palestinian people face death and destruction on a scale unlike anything they've ever faced before, but British-made arms are still being licensed to Israel and they're still being used to kill innocent people. So again, I say to our new government, it's time for us to uphold international law and end arms sales to Israel. The International Criminal Court chief prosecutor is seeking arrest warrants for Israeli and Hamas leaders for war crimes and crimes against humanity. This House does not aid and abet Hamas, but it does aid and abet Israel through arms sales like components for Israeli F-35s, known as the most lethal fighter jet on earth, which are raining down hell on Gaza. So, will the Prime Minister uphold international law, drop the nonsense about the most robust licensing system in the world, and end arms sales to Israel? And if the ICC issues arrest warrants, will he comply and ensure that these individuals are arrested if they enter the UK?
Over 35,000 people have died, 70% women and children. Gaza's healthcare system completely dismantled, every single university destroyed, as well as schools. And we see attacks on journalists, health workers, and the government has done very little. In fact, when we look at the role that we're playing, we are aiding and abetting what are war crimes that are happening on a daily basis. Our arms licensing system, which we're constantly told is robust, it's so stringent, that's an absolute lie. We have a precautionary principle, well, we're meant to anyway, which hasn't been upheld. And David Cameron, as Prime Minister in 2014, under a coalition government, reviewed arms sales to Israel during its conflict in Gaza and said that if that had continued, arms sales would be suspended. Now we have a higher death toll. We've got a potential assault into Rafah where 1.5 million people who are already displaced have nowhere left to go, and we are not suspending arms. It is unacceptable.
At the time of the making of this video, according to Al Jazeera English, so far, more than 42,000 Palestinians, including more than 16,000 children, have been killed in this war. According to The Lancet, it is not implausible to estimate that the actual death toll might even be up to 186,000 or even more. This has got to stop. It's time for an arms embargo against Israel and a ceasefire now.